The story of Maria Ridulph is a tragic tale and one of innocence lost that would affect not only her family but also her community. It would also greatly affect a friend who had been with her that night and witnessed the abduction for the rest of her life. Two little girls innocently playing in the snow outside the house were ripped apart by a real-life boogeyman who swept in and swept out, carrying little Maria away with him. Maria was one of 4 children born to parents Michael and Frances, and they lived in Sycamore, Illinois. Most of the adults in the area worked on local farms, but Michael worked at a factory, one of the few that existed there at that time. Frances was a homemaker, taking care of the family and the home, and they seemed to have a good life. It had started snowing on the evening of December 3, 1957, and Maria begged her parents to let her go out and play in the snow with her friend Kathy Sigmund. Although it was dark out, her parents said yes, and after dinner they went outside near Maria's home and were playing a game they called Duck the Cars, where they ran back and forth, avoiding the headlights of cars coming down the street. In that era it wasn't considered dangerous to let the kids out at night, as it was a fairly innocent time, a time when murders and violent crimes were not common at all. While they were out playing, Kathy stated a man had approached them who said his name was Johnny. He told them he was 24 years old and had no wife, and he offered Maria a piggyback ride. She went back to her house and retrieved her favorite doll to show the stranger, as it was her prized possession. When she returned, Kathy went back to her own house to get her mittens because it was so cold. When Kathy came back, both Maria and the stranger were gone. Unable to find Maria, Kathy went to her parents' house to tell them she couldn't find her. Maria's parents assumed she was hiding somewhere and sent their 11-year-old son out to find her. When he had no luck, the parents then called the police. Within an hour, the police had arrived along with armed civilians to search the town. They could find no trace of the little girl or the man who she had last been seen with. Within 2 days of her disappearance, the FBI was called in due to the possibility Maria had been kidnapped and taken across state lines. Numerous people had seen the 2 girls playing together that night, but nobody had seen the stranger with them up until 6:30 p.m. They therefore believed this stranger, Johnny, had approached Maria and Kathy after that time, and that Maria had been taken somewhere between 6:45 and 7 p.m. Because Kathy had been the only one to see Johnny, she was placed in protective custody in case he returned to take her or harm her. She was shown photos of possible suspects or those who had been convicted before to see if she could identify the man who called himself Johnny, but she could not. She was also asked to look at a lineup of suspects, and she pointed out a man named Thomas Joseph Rivard. However, Rivard had a tight alibi and couldn't have been the man they were looking for. He had only been placed in the lineup to fill up the numbers. Near Woodbine, Illinois, some 100 miles away from Sycamore, 2 tourists were searching a wooded area looking for mushrooms on April 26, 1958. What they found was the skeletal remains of a young child. The only clothing present was a shirt, socks, and undershirt, and the tiny body was beneath a tree that had partially fallen over. The state of decomposition indicated the body had been there for months, and it was later identified as Maria through dental records. The rest of the clothing she had been wearing the night she disappeared was nowhere to be seen. The young man who was considered a suspect right from the beginning was John Tessier. Originally from Ireland, he had moved to Sycamore after World War II ended with his British mother and American stepfather. The family home was just around the corner from the Ridulphs, and at the time John was 18 years old and planning on joining the Air Force. During the initial search and investigation into Maria's disappearance, investigators had visited John's home and spoken to his mother. She claimed John had been home all night, whereas his sisters would later testify this wasn't true. The investigators had received a tip regarding John, and it was speculated that it may have come from a resident or John's parents themselves, trying to clear their boy's name since he had the same name as Johnny and his physical description was a match. The next statement John made was that he had been in Rockford the night in question enlisting in the Air Force, which completely contradicted what his mother had said previously. He claimed he had called his parents from Rockford to get a ride home, as he had left his car back at the house. There was a telephone record of a collect call being made that night at 6:57 p.m. by a John Tessier. He then met with recruiting officers to drop off some paperwork, and they confirmed to the authorities that this occurred at around 7:15 p.m. that night. Despite this, an officer wasn't convinced and asked Tessier to take a polygraph test, which he complied with and passed. Because his alibi seemed to be truthful and he had passed a polygraph, he was released and taken off the list of suspects. Of note, Kathy Sigmund was never asked to identify John or look at his photograph. The following day, John left for training at the Air Force Base. In 2008, John Tessier's half-sister Janet provided new information that led to the case being reopened. She made a startling revelation that on her mother's deathbed she had stated the following. "Those two little girls, and the one that disappeared, John did it. John did it and you have to tell someone." Janet immediately assumed her mother was talking about the murder of Maria Ridulph and had been told by her elder sisters that their mother had lied to the police that night about John's whereabouts. Another of the half-sisters, Mary, was also there when their mother made the statement about John being guilty, but she only heard the words "he did it." Nevertheless, she also assumed it was to do with the Maria Ridulph case. At the time of their mother's death, John was not involved in the family, having previously molested a younger half-sister and threatened Janet with a gun. He wasn't even allowed to come to his mother's funeral. Janet had made numerous attempts since her mother's death to get the Sycamore police and the FBI to consider her mother's statement. She eventually sent an email to the Illinois State Police tip line, and it was handed to the cold case unit to investigate. All of John's sisters had suspected him of being the murderer. The investigators were able to create a different timeline, showing that John did have time to drive to Rockford after snatching Maria and making the phone call to his parents and meeting with the recruitment officers. This shed a whole new light on his so-called alibi. Finally, Kathy Sigmund, Maria's friend who had been there that dreadful night, was shown a photograph of John as he was back then. She immediately identified him as the stranger, Johnny, who had disappeared with Maria. More and more evidence was stacking up against John as witnesses recalled new information and other witnesses came forward. In 2011, John was asked to come into the police station to answer some questions. Whenever he was asked about that night or Maria Ridulph, he would become aggressive and evasive with his answers. He refused to answer any further questions and was subsequently arrested for the abduction and murder of Maria. The same month, Maria's tiny body was exhumed and tested for DNA evidence with no luck. A forensic anthropologist examined the skeleton and was able to determine she had been stabbed in the throat with a long blade at least 3 times. Although this was most likely the cause of death, other causes couldn't be ruled out due to the lack of soft tissue, with which other injuries such as strangulation may have been identified. Nevertheless, the case was pursued and a trial set. John went to trial in September 2012 for the murder of Maria. Evidence and testimonies were heard from those who had been involved in the case, as well as from some inmates who claimed John had confessed to the murder while awaiting trial. One claimed John said he strangled her with a wire, while another claimed John said he smothered her accidentally while trying to stop her from screaming. On September 14, he was found guilty of the abduction and murder of Maria and was given a life sentence. A parole period of 20 years was given, however. John was 73 years of age at the time of the sentencing. John filed a petition for post-conviction relief in 2015, and after extensive investigation by the state's attorney, it was determined that he was innocent. A court hearing took place in March 2016, and the conviction was overturned. The dismissal of the charge of murder was without prejudice, which means that another charge of murder of Maria Ridulph could be brought against him in the future.